in medical school. But that's not what's interesting about him. Here's what he says. He says, you know what's better than all these cures I stuck in here? Prevention. Your goal is not to get the disease to begin with. If you cannot get the disease, that's way better than getting the disease, risking dying and getting cured, and then dealing with the side effects of the disease later. That's why he's the father of modern medicine. He's that guy who said, interrupt the transmission vectors. So when I was taught this in school, I was taught that Semmelweis, the Hungarian, figured this out. Yes, Semmelweis, the Hungarian, figured it out again 800 years after ibne-sina figured it out first. Ibne-sina had a contemporary. His name was ibn-al-haytham. Actually, for the record, neither guy was actually called ibne-sina or ibn-al-haytham. Their names were shockingly similar, and so it's hard to keep them apart. Abu Ali al-Hassan, ibn-Abdullah, ibn-al-haytham, I think is ibn-al-haytham, and then Abu Ali al-Hussein, ibn Abdullah, ibne-sina. So we just went, screw it, we're just going to use the last parts of their names, which is like their grandfather's name, and we're just going to reject the rest of it so that I don't have to remember which Abu Ali I'm talking about, and we can move on. So, Ibn al-Haytham was from Iraq, he was from Basra. He ended up, by the way, al-farabi actually was a student of Ishaq after Baghdad was created. That became the repository of knowledge. Baghdad was the center of it all. And Ishaq was a Christian Arab. And I just thought I'd throw that in there because I want to make sure that I didn't ignore the fact that this isn't just a Muslim project. This was also a Christian, and for that matter, there were Jews involved in this as well, because this was a tolerant society that embraced the differences and allowed them to thrive. And so Ibn al-Haytham goes to Cairo, and he starts working at Al-Azhar as a professor. Al-Azhar was a brand new school and mosque in a brand new city. Cairo is like the baby of the Middle East. It's only 1,000 years old, which is a joke for age, right? And everybody's like, oh, Cairo, so young. It's such a noob. And so Ibn al-Haytham is right there at the beginning, and he writes a book which in 1021 is the Book of Optics. We think Ibn al-Haytham wrote 120 books. We have 30 of them. We're missing 90. Of the 30 that we have, they're almost all on mathematics. He was a mathematical genius. He started doing calculus before anybody. So, yeah, sorry, it wasn't Leibniz or Newton. It was Ibn al-Haytham. He's the guy who came up with the scientific method. So when I was a kid, I was taught it was either Galileo or it was Francis Bacon. Galileo maybe did something cool with cannonballs at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I don't know. Galileo Galilei, I mispronounced his name. It's probably apocryphal. It probably didn't really happen. But if he did do the cannonball thing, that's all sorts of fun. Because you just say, look out below, and then he drops cannonballs. The reason he did it was he was trying to prove whether or not Aristotle's assumptions about the heavier object will hit the ground first was true or not. And of course, they saw the two objects hit the ground at the same time. He had a solid cannonball and a hollow cannonball. So if Aristotle was right, the solid one would hit first. And Aristotle wasn't right. Well, but he was kind of, but that's too complicated. We don't need to do that. It turns out it is true. The heavier object will hit first. It's just the cannonballs relative to the size of the Earth. Who cares? So the only way you can measure the heavier one hitting first is if you had lasers sophisticated enough to pick up the nanosecond difference between contact. In other words, if I had an object the size of the moon and an object the size of Mars, and I ran them towards the Earth, the Mars-sized object would hit first. But anyway, that's because of the way gravity works. So it was Ibn al-Haytham. He had a 6-step method for the scientific method. He's the guy who figured out the lens. I'm very grateful. Every day I wake up, I go, thank you. And I put them on. He reinvented the camera obscura. Lao Tzu invented the world's first camera obscura, but his material was just largely destroyed and not enough of it made it through. Ibn al-Haytham reinvented the camera obscura. During this time period, actually before this time period, around the year 800, the Arabs invented modern agriculture. The way they did that was they de-peasantized the population of farmers that they had inherited when they conquered the Persian and Roman empires. And they created private property with the hope that then the peasants who were now free, who now owned their own land, could do whatever they wanted to with it. They would experiment and they'd figure out the best ways to do agriculture instead of just doing the same old thing over and over again. In other words, the incentive of profit motivation might trigger something, and it does. One of the things that they figure out is crop rotation. They're the guys who invent that. They also realize, don't keep planting the same crop over and over again. What if there's a blight? What if there's an insect plague? You're reliant on one food, makes you dangerously at the mercy of that food. And so you need to have diversified crops. So one of the things the Arabs did was they went around looking for new things to grow, and they're the guys who start the coffee industry. They take these beans that they find in Ethiopia that they realize they can do something with, and they bring them to Yemen, and they plant them in the province of Yemen named Mocha, and start the coffee industry. They also realize you can pack fresh food on a ship and send it to the other side of Asia. All you had to do is pack it full of ice. And so they were sending fresh food to China and India by packing ships full of ice. They had plumbing. And by plumbing, I mean fresh water was pumped in, sewage water was pumped out. They invented water wheels to make the pumping work, so you could just use the power of a river to run your pump. They lit up their streets at night. So in other words, if you walk down the streets of Baghdad 1,000 years ago, as you're walking down that street at night, there were oil lamps. In other words, if I took a satellite and I put it in orbit around the Earth 1,000 years ago and I stuck it so it was always at night, so I'd see the whole planet at night and photographed it. The whole planet's pitch dark, except for everything from Iraq to Pakistan, the cities twinkled like they do now. Ibn-al-haytham speculated that all objects in the universe exerted gravity. I don't know how you observe that. I mean, I get that the floor is exerting gravity over me, but he said all objects. How is the wall pulling me? I don't experience that. He also said light has a finite speed and it travels in waves. His book of optics was 1021. This was 1,001 years ago. They dabbled in psychology. Ibne-Khaldun comes along. Ibne-Khaldun says, it's okay to read history, but you need to be a skeptic. Historians lie. Don't believe everything you read. Don't read Herodotus and take him at his word, because he's a liar. We need to think about what he's saying and ask why is he saying what he's saying. He also says we should have a systematic study of politics and sociology and demographics. In other words, he's the inventor of the social sciences, including their little separate categories. In other words, he's the founder of political science.